Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our job is to take complex, sprawling global topics, stack up the research, and give you, the learner, the essential insight you need to understand their significance in the modern world. Today, we're diving into a geopolitical body whose enduring success is built entirely on, well, the massive paradox of not choosing a side.
It is the ultimate act of collective rebellion against a geopolitical binary. We are, of course, talking about the non-aligned movement, or NAY.
Right.
And if your first instinct is to file that name under Cold War relic, you're missing the biggest global story nobody is talking about.
Exactly. I have to admit, I thought it was purely historical, a footnote in the history of NATO and the Warsaw Pact.
A lot of people do.
But what our sources show is that NAY isn't just alive. It's massive, it's organized, and it is flexing real political muscle in a way that directly shapes global politics, especially now, as new great power competition heats up again.
So let's just set the scope for you. This is not a small, quiet club. After the United Nations itself, the non-aligned movement is the largest grouping of sovereign states worldwide.
The largest after the UN.
The largest. We are talking about an astonishing 121 member states and 18 observer states.
Wow.
Think about that for a moment. This collective represents nearly 2/3 of the UN's total membership and a whopping 55% of the global population. This isn't just a voice, it's a chorus.
Okay, so our mission today is to pull back the curtain on this giant mechanism. We need to understand its traumatic origins in the intense bipolarization of the 1950s Cold War.
We have to grasp the foundational principles that somehow managed to weld together such a radically diverse group.
And this is the crucial part. Explore how it has reinvented itself since 1991 to become the powerful, unified diplomatic voice of the Global South against new forms of economic and political inequality. Okay, let's unpack this movement, starting right at the beginning.
To truly appreciate why NAM was so necessary, you have to rewind. Go back to the post-World War II period, specifically the early to mid-1950s.
Right.
The world had just emerged from the brutal chaos of global conflict, but instead of settling into peace, it immediately began to cleave into two distinct, antagonistic spheres of influence.
And the moment the Korean War broke out in 1950, that division became existential, didn't it? You had the pro-Soviet socialist bloc, anchored by the newly formed Warsaw Pact.
And on the other side, the pro-American capitalist group dominated by NATO. And this wasn't just, an ideological divide. It was a military and economic ultimatum.
An ultimatum for who, exactly?
Well, this rapid, aggressive bipolarization created an immense problem for newly independent nations. Remember, this era saw an explosion of decolonization.
Of course, all across Africa and Asia.
Exactly. States were finally achieving sovereignty after generations of foreign rule. They had fought so hard to kick out their colonizers, and then suddenly, two new global superpowers were knocking on their door demanding allegiance. It was like a global draft.
And the price of aid or security often meant joining one of these military blocs.
And giving up a degree of that national autonomy you just fought for.
So the problem NAM solved was, well, it was straightforward. It provided a viable third path. It was a principled rejection of the idea that sovereignty meant simply exchanging one master for another.
And this path, this idea, it began remarkably early. The sources show the term non-alignment was actually used for the first time at the UN in 1950.
As early as 1950?
Yes, by India and Yugoslavia. They were already signaling to the global community their refusal to be conscripted into the massive multi-alliances that were crystallizing around the Korean conflict.
It's so interesting that the concept was articulated before the movement was even a formal thing. We see the Indian diplomat, V.K. Krishna Menon, taking up that mantle, formally representing this doctrine at the UN in 1953. He was really setting the stage.
But theory needs practice. It needs a catalytic event. And that takes us to the truly foundational moment, the Bandung Conference in 1955. This was far more than just a diplomatic meeting. It was a declaration of identity for the nascent Global South. Hosted by Indonesian President Sukarno, it gathered leaders from 29 African and Asian states. These were nations representing over half the world's population at the time.
And who are the main players here? We're talking about true giants of 20th century history.
Absolutely. Think of this as the first grand coalition of the decolonized world. You had Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Sukarno himself, of course, Josip Broz Tito of Yugoslavia, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana.
That is a powerful lineup. These leaders represented entirely different cultures and political systems.
Completely different. But they were unified by their recent history of subjugation and their shared, very real fear of neocolonialism.
And their achievement at Bandung was the adoption of the Declaration on Promotion of World Peace and Cooperation. That sounds broad, but I imagine it was a radical shift in who was defining world peace.
It was revolutionary because it centered the concerns of the developing world. And that spirit was then formalized a year later, in 1956, with the Brujuni Declaration.
Brujuni.
Yeah.
So this is where the core three really solidify it.
The core three, Tito, Nehru, and Nasser. This declaration moved the idea from a regional assertion that was Bandung to a globally applicable doctrine.
I think we need to linger on the philosophy they outlined there because it gets right to the heart of NAM's mission. It wasn't just passive neutrality, was it?
Oh, far from it. They made their philosophy explicit. There's a key passage, they stated. Peace cannot be achieved with separation, but with the aspiration towards collective security in global terms and expansion of freedom, as well as terminating the domination of one country over another.
That fundamentally reframes the whole debate. They weren't just saying, leave us alone.
No, they were saying, the world system is inherently unstable because of superpower rivalry, and we must collectively build a new, inclusive security framework.
That insistence on collective security and terminating domination, that's what makes it a proactive movement. And this paved the way for the formal establishment in 1961.
In Belgrade, Yugoslavia, the first conference of heads of state or government of non-aligned countries.
And the location itself, Belgrade, right on the edge of the Soviet sphere in Europe. That was a political statement.
A very powerful choice. And once they were formalized, they needed a guiding creed, a set of behavioral rules that could hold together over 100 vastly different nations. That creed became the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence.
Panchil.
Exactly, Panchil.
Let's detail those principles because they are really the constitutional core of the entire movement. They originated in Sino-Indian relations back in 1954, but they became the bedrock of a name.
They are deceptively simple. First, mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty. This protects nations from aggressive neighbors and, of course, former colonial masters. Second, mutual non-aggression. Third, mutual non-interference in domestic affairs. And this is perhaps the most crucial principle for newly sovereign states.
You can see why. It ensures that foreign powers, superpowers, or even neighbors cannot meddle in their fragile national politics.
It was a direct rejection of both the U.S. strategy of intervening against communism and the Soviet strategy of imposing socialist regimes.
Right. If you look at the 1960s, so much of the Cold War was fought through proxy conflicts and internal interference.
Precisely. NAM provided a shared diplomatic shield against that very mechanism.
Okay, so what are the last two?
The remaining principles are, fourth, equality and mutual benefit, and finally, fifth, peaceful coexistence. Together, they form a kind of anti-domination pact.
It's a moral and legal critique wrapped up in a foreign policy doctrine. And that comprehensive anti-domination mandate was perfectly summarized years later in the 1979 Havana Declaration by Fidel Castro. He really defined the organization's explicit mission there.
Castro framed the purpose as ensuring the national independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and security of non-aligned countries in their struggle against imperialism, colonialism, neocolonialism, racism, and all forms of foreign aggression, occupation, domination, interference, or hegemony, as well as against great power and bloc politics.
He left nothing out. It was a comprehensive charter for liberation.
It was.
So NAM was founded not just to sit on the fence, but to actively struggle against all forms of global power abuse. And this set them up for massive success, but also massive internal tension in the decades to follow.
With that comprehensive mandate, the movement achieved major political traction and remarkably quickly, particularly throughout the 1950s and 1960s. The early years of NA were really characterized by tangible achievements in the global arena.
The momentum of decolonization seems intrinsically linked to the movement's growth.
Oh, absolutely. NAM was instrumental in pushing the decolonization agenda globally. They lent immense moral and political weight to independence movements at the UN.
So they were effectively mobilizing global opinion.
Yes, against continued colonial rule, even when Western powers were dragging their feet. And beyond decolonization, they had successes in disarmament efforts, a really strong opposition to racism, and they were pivotal in the global campaign against apartheid in South Africa.
So by 1970, the movement felt strong enough to start defining internal behavior too. The Lusaka Conference, they expanded their aims, formalizing expectations for member states.
Right. They moved beyond just external opposition. They added aims like the peaceful resolution of internal disputes, the explicit abstention from big power military alliances, and a strict opposition to the stationing of military bases in foreign countries.
These additions were designed to police the behavior of members then, to make sure that non-alignment wasn't just a convenient label,
But a real commitment.
but the real shift in the 1970s and 80s seems to be this recognition that military non-alignment wasn't enough. The structural power imbalance was primarily economic, and they started targeting the nuts and bolts of global wealth distribution.
This is where NIM broadened its mandate significantly. It moved into the highly technical domain of international economics and information flow. They sponsored two massive, coordinated global campaigns. First, the push for the new international economic order.
The NIEO. That sounds like a revolutionary proposal. What exactly were the practical mechanisms they were demanding to restructure commercial relations?
Well, they argued that the post-war system, the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, was inherently rigged against resource-rich but cash-poor developing nations.
Right.
So their NIEO demands included very concrete things: guaranteeing national sovereignty over their own natural resources, regulating multinational corporations, increasing development aid without conditions, and crucially, establishing preferential trade agreements for developing countries.
And they used their combined voting power in the UN General Assembly to push through declarations supporting these principles.
That was the strategy.
So it was an attempt to democratize global capitalism, or at least make it less extractive. And simultaneously, they tackled information flow with the New World Information and Communication Order, the NWICO.
Exactly. They saw information control as another form of neocolonialism, a cultural one. At the time, global news flow was almost entirely dominated by four major Western agencies: AP, UPI, Reuters, and AFP.
So the argument was that this created a biased narrative.
A deeply biased one. NA argued that this coverage distorted the image of developing nations and consistently served the interests of the powerful.
And the tangible outcome of that push was the establishment of the Non-Aligned News Agencies pool in 1975.
A physical mechanism to achieve collective self-reliance in information. This pool aimed to share news directly between member states, bypassing those Western gatekeepers.
Did it work?
It struggled with funding and infrastructure, but it was a massive political statement about media sovereignty and cultural independence. It later transitioned into what's now the NAM News Network.
This coordinated power became, well, terrifyingly real to the Western Bloc in 1975, with that specific political action in the UN General Assembly.
That was truly the high water mark of their collective diplomatic clout. In 1975, the NAM bloc, combined with the Arab and Soviet blocs, successfully pushed UN General Assembly Resolution 3379.
And this was the resolution that made a bold, non-binding declaration, formally equating Zionism with South Africa's apartheid and racial discrimination.
It did.
That coalition, NAM, the Arab bloc, and the Soviet bloc, it was powerful enough to completely reframe a massive international debate. What was the political calculus there?
It was a perfect storm of interests. The NAM supplied the sheer numbers, the majority of the General Assembly members. The Arab bloc provided the motivation and the specific agenda. And the Soviet bloc provided the ideological backing against Western interests.
And the resolution passed overwhelmingly.
It did, and it demonstrated that when the Global South voted as one unified front, it could dictate the moral and political narrative of the world's most important diplomatic body. This resolution, although it was later revoked, it led to a cascade of subsequent resolutions systematically condemning Israel, which really reinforced their strength.
However, this picture of global unity, it fractured internally. How did the movement reconcile its core principles of non-aggression when some of its most prominent members were locked in brutal conflicts with each other?
That tension was the organization's persistent Achilles heel. Despite all the shared rhetoric of peace and non-aggression, you had deep existential conflicts between members, most notably India and Pakistan, and later the absolutely devastating war between Iran and Iraq.
So it always raised questions about whether the commitment to peace applied externally to the superpowers, but internally.
Internally, the commitment was often secondary to national interests. It just highlighted the inherent challenge of unifying over 100 sovereign states under one diplomatic banner.
And this inherent problem of cohesion came to a head with the ultimate moment of fragmentation. The Cuban paradox and the Soviet-Afghan War in 1979. Cuba was actively seeking leadership in the 70s, right?
Yeah.
Positioning itself as a revolutionary beacon.
Oh, they were masterful at it. Cuba established military and social missions across Africa and Central America, a policy they called internationalism.
And this was praised.
It was openly applauded at the 1976 conference, particularly for Cuba's military assistance to Angola against South Africa's racist regime. This earned Castro immense revolutionary credit among NAM members.
So by 1979, Cuban prestige was at its absolute peak.
No question. The 1979 Havana Conference saw Fidel Castro become the chairman of NAM and the movement's de facto spokesman. He hosted the event, radiating revolutionary confidence. And critically, most attendees genuinely believed Cuba was acting as an independent, revolutionary, non-aligned state.
Distinct from Soviet dictates.
That's what they believed.
And then, just months later, the ultimate test of non-alignment arrived.
In December 1979, the Soviet Union intervened in the civil war of Afghanistan. And the crucial point here is that Afghanistan was an active, committed NIM member state.
An invasion of one of their own.
A violation of the most sacred principles of the movement, mutual non-aggression and non-interference.
So how did NI react?
They reacted strongly, which actually demonstrated their genuine commitment to the non-interference principle. When the UN held a vote condemning the USSR's invasion, the non-aligned members overwhelmingly voted 56-9 to condemn the USSR. The world expected NMM's chairman, Castro, to lead this condemnation.
Wait. Cuba, the newly minted leader of the non-aligned movement, voted against the resolution. They publicly backed the Soviet Union.
A monumental diplomatic betrayal. Castro, who was supposed to be the spokesman for the world's biggest peace movement, chose his revolutionary allegiance to his Soviet sponsor over the core principle of defending a fellow member's sovereignty.
I can't imagine the fallout.
It was immense. This single action deeply and irreparably split the movement, particularly among the Muslim states who saw the Soviet invasion as aggression against a Muslim country. Cuba's credibility was shattered just overnight. It cost Castro his non-aligned leadership and his reputation for decades.
It proved that for some members, ideology still trumped non-alignment.
It did, a very painful lesson for the movement.
That's a powerful illustration of the movement's fragility. And yet it managed to survive. So we have to ask, how did an organization that just weathered such a massive political split manage to remain structurally intact?
That's the brilliant strategic paradox of NM's organizational structure. I mean, given the massive internal tensions and the sheer scale of 121 members, you would expect a colossal bureaucracy.
Right, a huge, rigid institution.
But NM intentionally lacks a strict, permanent organizational structure.
That flies in the face of modern international organization theory. Why the deliberate lack of institutional rigor?
It stems directly from its anti-bloc origins. Think about it. Creating a rigid bureaucracy, a permanent headquarters, or a standing military command would make it look and feel exactly like the geopolitical and military structures they were founded to oppose.
Like NATO or the Warsaw Pact.
Exactly. They define themselves by their fluidity and their non-hierarchical nature.
So where does the actual power and coordination sit within this deliberately decentralized system?
The authority is concentrated at the top and handled dynamically. The highest decision-making authority is the Summit Conference of Heads of State, or Government of Non-Aligned States, which meets roughly every 3 to 4 years. This summit is where the policy, the direction, and the agenda are defined.
And the chairmanship is a temporary but crucial role.
Absolutely. The chairmanship rotates. It changes hands at every summit to the country hosting the event. This ensures a broad geographic representation and prevents any single country or handful of countries from permanently dominating the movement. It's a mechanism for enforced democracy.
And we've seen that rotation move all over the world, maintaining continuity. Iran held the chair from 2012 to 2015, then Venezuela, then Azerbaijan.
And now, as of the January 2024 summit, Uganda holds the incumbent chair. So you've got Asia, South America, the edge of Europe, and Africa just in that recent list.
Okay, so the summit is the top authority, but what about the day-to-day work?
That falls to the Coordinating Bureau. This is especially important for coordinating the bloc's diplomatic activities at the UN. The Bureau is based right at the UN headquarters in New York City, and it directs the work of the movement's numerous task forces, committees, and working groups.
This flexible structure allows for something truly remarkable, which is this incredibly diverse ideological coalition that still manages to agree on core foreign policy goals.
The ideological tent is astonishingly wide. I mean, think about the leaders involved over the years. You have Josip Broz Tito, a committed Marxist-Leninist leader in Yugoslavia,
Hmm.
and then you have Suharto, the famously anti-communist militaristic leader of Indonesia. Right. Or, more recently, you have Nelson Mandela, a democratic socialist, alongside Mohamed Morsi, a conservative Islamist from Egypt.
So how did that actually work in practice?
Yeah.
How do such diametrically opposed regimes achieve any kind of unity?
Their unity lies not in domestic ideology, but in their shared international commitment, a declared commitment to world peace, collective security, and resisting external domination. They agree on how they should interact with the rest of the world, even if they violently disagree on how they should govern themselves.
I see.
At the 1983 New Delhi summit, NA even described itself as history's biggest peace movement. That's a testament to the collective ambition, despite all the internal contradictions.
So how strict are the membership requirements for this massive, diverse club? Does a country need to be truly neutral or just non-aligned with the big alliances?
The requirements are based heavily on those original 10 Bandung principles. They are essentially a commitment to the fundamental tenets of international law.
Respect for sovereignty, non-interference.
Exactly. Respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. Abstention from intervention or interference, refraining from aggression, and respecting international obligations. The single biggest requirement, though, and this is the one that caused Malta and Cyprus to leave, is that you cannot be part of a multilateral military alliance anchored by a major power, like NATO.
Looking at the geography, it is overwhelmingly a global South organization in scope.
Absolutely. The membership is concentrated in countries that are defined as developing. The concentration in Africa is near absolute. Every single African country is a current member of NM.
Everyone.
Everyone. And geographically, Europe is virtually empty. It currently only hosts 2 members, Azerbaijan and Belarus. This concentration really reinforces its contemporary role as the major unified diplomatic voice for the developing world.
We mentioned the founding states earlier. What is the status of the pivotal nations like Yugoslavia and India today?
Their status reflects the turbulent history of the past 30 years. Yugoslavia's membership was suspended in 1992 following its collapse and breakup. The successor states, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Montenegro, and Serbia, they all retain observer status.
So they keep diplomatic ties but are no longer core members.
Correct. And Malta and Cyprus, as we said, ceased their membership in 2004 when they joined the European Union. Their required participation in the EU's common security and defense policy conflicted with that principle of abstaining from multilateral military pacts.
And India, a co-founder, a historically essential leader.
India has visibly downgraded its emphasis on the movement since the Cold War ended. It seems to be focusing instead on forging bilateral ties and playing a more active role in other forums, like the Quad.
This leads us to the observer status, which is a fascinating layer of complexity here. These are countries or organizations that watch and participate, but aren't full members. And the list includes some massive global players.
This is where NM's diplomatic weight becomes really evident. China has been an observer since 1992. They understand that nearly 2/3 of the UN members are in this bloc.
You'd want a seat at that table.
And critically, Russia was granted observer status in 2021. The presence of these 2 major world powers, the very powers NM was designed to avoid, as observers just underscores the sheer diplomatic influence of the 121 member states they are trying to influence and woo.
And that sets up the biggest pivot in the movement's history. The need to find a new purpose after the world fundamentally changed.
When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and the Warsaw Pact dissolved, well, the very reason for NM's existence counterbalancing 2 superpowers vanished overnight. This triggered a severe identity crisis.
The fundamental question must have been, if the threat of bipolarity is gone, are we still needed? Did the foundational ideologies of national independence and anti-colonialism still apply in this brave new world?
Exactly. They were forced to redefine their enemy. And after some intense internal debate, the conclusion was not that the conflict had ended, but that the structure of domination had changed.
So,
The world's poorest nations remained exploited and marginalized, but no longer by 2 opposing ideological spheres. Instead, they faced a unipolar world dominated by a single geopolitical, economic, and cultural approach.
so the enemy became consolidated. They essentially realigned themselves to challenge Western hegemony and neocolonialism.
It was a brilliant pivot that ensured their survival. The movement shifted its focus from tactical neutrality between 2 competing blocs to actively challenging the dominant global structure. They understood that the struggle for sovereignty had moved from the military sphere to the financial and economic sphere.
This led directly to the formalized Global South strategy. NAM emphasized multilateralism, equality, and mutual non-aggression to forge a unified front.
Well, with a
What
goal.
was the goal of this strategy in practical terms?
The primary goal was leverage. NAM aimed to increase the collective political leverage of its member states when negotiating with developed nations or international institutions on issues like trade, debt relief, climate policy, or political conflicts.
Because a single developing nation has very little power.
Very little. But 121 nations speaking with a unified voice have immense power.
The rhetoric around anti-imperialism evolved from being about military bases to being about global economic systems.
The focus shifted dramatically towards socio-economic challenges. NAM began identifying economic underdevelopment, poverty, social injustices, and environmental crises as the growing threats to peace and security rather than just troop movements.
Let's unpack those new threats specifically, because this is where the modern relevance really lies.
Yeah.
What are they actively resisting now?
They're resisting what they view as structural inequality inherent in the modern globalized system. Specifically, they oppose the inequalities manifested by globalization, arguing that its rules, often set by developed economies, systematically favor the rich world.
And they oppose the implications of neoliberal policies that frequently accompany international loans or trade agreements.
Yes, policies which often require privatization or deregulation. And the debt crisis is a perpetual focus for them, isn't it?
It is central. They actively fight the crushing burden of debt and what they deem unfair trade practices, arguing that past colonial exploitation and current resource extraction models created this untenable debt cycle.
And this leads right into the critique of the IMF and the World Bank. The term they use is donor conditionality. For the listener, what exactly is donor conditionality, and why does N view it as neo-colonial?
Well, donor conditionality refers to the policy requirements tied to the issuance of development aid or structural adjustment loans. So, for example, if a country needs an emergency loan from the IMF might mandate that the borrowing government must cut social spending, privatize state-owned enterprises.
Like electricity or water utilities.
Right. Or aggressively open its markets to foreign competition, which, in the view of Vietnam, compromises sovereignty.
Exactly. NAM views this as the new mechanism of domination. Powerful donor countries or institutions dictate internal policy, undermining the national independence of the receiving state.
And on top of that, they criticize the lack of transparency and democracy in international financial decision-making.
Yes, NAM argues that institutions like the UN Security Council, the World Bank, and the IMF are still fundamentally undemocratic. They function as instruments of developed world hegemony. The struggle against domination has moved from the battlefield to the boardroom.
So if NAM has redefined itself as the collective voice of the Global South, how does it convert that sheer weight of numbers, 121 members, into practical influence today?
The most visible area is its outspoken advocacy for UN reform. This is the mechanism by which they attempt to address that structural inequality in global governance.
Makes sense.
NAM is openly critical of current UN structures, stating that the organization is too often manipulated by powerful states in ways that violate the fundamental principles of sovereignty and equality that all NA members share.
It's logical. They represent 2/3 of the UN members, yet the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the US, UK, France, Russia, and China, wield disproportionate veto power.
And that is the core frustration. NAM specifically advocates for the structural reform of the UN Security Council, the UNSC, to improve transparency, democracy, and critically, the representation and power of non-aligned states.
They want the structure, which was codified in 1945, to be updated to reflect the geopolitical realities of the 21st century.
And the overwhelming voice of the Global South. They often demand restrictions on or even the abolition of the veto power.
And to manage this huge diplomatic agenda, the Coordinating Bureau relies heavily on specialized working groups chaired by member states. This shows a high degree of operational specialization.
That's how they execute the collective agenda. For instance, Egypt chairs the working group on the reform of the UN Security Council, so they're actively coordinating NAM's proposals at the UN.
And there are others.
Oh yes. Indonesia chairs the working group on disarmament. Crucially, Venezuela leads the working group on unilateral coercive measures, which is the mechanism for coordinating opposition and legal challenges against economic sanctions imposed by powerful nations. Morocco even shares a group on peacekeeping operations.
Beyond structural reform, The movement maintains its original, powerful commitment to specific decolonization and self-determination causes that have been stuck on the UN agenda for decades.
The long memory of the movement is key here. They have consistently supported the discussion of Puerto Rico's self-determination before the UN since 1961,
It's 1961.
arguing for the island's right to choose its own future free from U.S. control. Likewise, since 1973, they have supported the discussion of Western Sahara's self-determination, reaffirming their support for the Sahrawi people.
This consistency shows that the anti-colonial mandate is deeply woven into NAM's identity, regardless of the year.
It is. And speaking of consistency, NAM remains a unified voice of criticism against the foreign policy actions taken by the sole remaining superpower after 1991.
They've repeatedly issued communiques openly denouncing specific U.S. actions.
Denouncing them as roughshod attempts over smaller nation sovereignty. This includes its strong criticism of the 2003 invasion of Iraq and aspects of the wider war on terrorism, arguing these actions violated international law and national sovereignty.
They also criticize attempts to stifle countries' legitimate aspirations for development, like with Iran and North Korea's nuclear plans.
Right, that focus on double standards is constant. Kim Jong-nam, the chairman of North Korea's Parliamentary Standing Committee, publicly articulated this stance, arguing that the U.S. attempts to deprive countries of their legitimate right to peaceful nuclear activities. It highlights the opposition to perceived political double standards.
We've covered the political and diplomatic front. Now let's move to the practical, developmental side, the mechanism of collective self-reliance. This is perhaps the most tangible evidence of their post-Cold War reinvention. And this is where the NA Center for South Technical Cooperation comes in.
This is a major engine for the Global South strategy. The Non-Aligned Movement Center for South Technical Cooperation, or NMCSSTC, is located in Jakarta, Indonesia.
And it was strategically set up after 1991.
Specifically to promote development and accelerate growth in developing countries by fostering collective self-reliance, meaning relying on each other rather than on developed nations for technical aid.
This sounds like a practical application of that equality principle. What kind of technical activities does the center actually organize?
They focus on sharing expertise and building practical national capacity. For instance, this includes dispatching agricultural experts to assist countries like Myanmar with crop science. They run international training programs on high-tech methods like tissue culture propagation.
So it's real knowledge sharing.
It is. And they organize workshops on shared economic threats, like those focused on the eradication of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing practices. The goal is lateral knowledge transfer among developing nations.
That's fascinating. It shows the movement operating outside of the diplomatic halls. And the sources point to other specialized centers too, right?
That's correct. The NAM network recognizes that development requires specialization. You have other specialized centers focusing on health, based in Cuba, human rights, located in Iran, and technology, with the Center for Science and Technology based in India. These centers maintain the operational relevance of the movement across crucial sectors.
Finally, we have to touch on the critical modern debate about cultural diversity and human rights, especially as it relates to Western pressure.
It's a key point. NA accepts the universality of human rights and social justice. However, they strongly resist what they term cultural homogenization.
What does that mean in practice?
It's their pushback against the idea that a single, specific interpretation of human rights, often one derived from Western liberal democratic traditions, should be universally imposed on everyone else.
They're essentially arguing that context matters.
Precisely. In line with their foundational principles of sovereignty and non-interference, they appeal for the protection of cultural diversity and tolerance of the religious, socio-cultural, and historical particularities that define human rights in specific regions.
So they believe that while the goals of human rights are universal, the application and prioritization must respect the diversity of the world.
And that serves as a diplomatic shield against what they perceive as cultural or political hegemony disguised as advocacy.
We've traced the remarkable 60-year journey of the non-aligned movement. It was born as a necessary defensive response to Cold War bipolarity, led by the visionaries of Bandung, and has sustained itself by constantly adapting its purpose.
It really has.
It evolved into a unified diplomatic mechanism that speaks for the majority of the world's population, fundamentally changing its focus from military non-alignment to economic and cultural anti-hegemony.
It is a remarkable story of adaptability, particularly given the near-fatal ideological fractures caused by events like the Cuban betrayal. The sheer consistency of the organization just demonstrates its fundamental importance to the Global South.
And we see this continuity in the summits.
Yes, like the recent 19th summit held in Kampala, Uganda in January 2024, which focused its agenda on deepening cooperation for shared global affluence.
And it shows their relevance in reacting to modern, unexpected crises. Think back to the online summit they organized in May 2020, titled United Against COVID-19.
That was a perfect example. It demonstrated how quickly they can activate their multilateral framework to address global health and economic emergencies that disproportionately affect developing nations.
And it really solidifies their role, not as a historical footnote, but as a standing diplomatic power.
NAM proved that states could actively refuse to be defined by Cold War alliances and still exercise significant global clout. But here is the final provocative thought we want to leave you with. Great power competition between the US, China, and Russia is undeniably rising again. It's ushering in a potentially new era of bipolarity, or maybe multipolarity. So the question is the movement's 60-year-old insistence on non-alignment, multilateral cooperation, and challenging the powerful finally returning to its original radical form?
And what would that renewed radical non-alignment actually look like in practice if the former core members like India are downgrading their participation, while major competitors like China and Russia stand on the sidelines as observers? If N reasserts its power in a new bipolar world, it will redefine what winning means for 55% of the planet.
It will.
That's something to consider as you watch the global landscape unfold.
A powerful thought to explore. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.
We'll see you next time.